Hi, everyone, and welcome to our tea break webinar. I'm going to start getting started now. So I'm hoping you can all see my screen okay. In today's session, we're going to be talking all about filtering with Flourish and how you can use filtering across a load of our different templates. Just to give a bit of agenda for what we'll be covering today. My name's Helena and I'm on the support and content team at Flourish, and Ilias, my colleague, will be ready in the chat with any questions that you have. You can post these throughout the session and Ilias will do his best to help you, or we can save them if we have some time at the end of the session. We'll be uploading these slides and a recording of the webinar to our training page after the session, so you'll be able to access them and go back through the session there if you're interested. So it's all about filtering today. We're going to talk a little bit about what is filtering and why you might want to use it. We'll then go into which templates in Flourish support filtering. And then we'll dive into the app and do a bit of demoing about how to use filters, as they can work slightly differently across templates. We'll dive a bit deeper into the line bar pie template and how you filter there, as there's a few different options for filtering available. And then we'll finish off with animating through time and how you can use time sliders with your time series data to create animated visualizations. So to start with, what is filtering all about? So filtering involves adding user-facing controls to your visualizations. And in Flourish, that generally means one of these three types of controls. We've got drop-down menus up here. We've got a time slider in the middle, which is for time series data, so that you can have a play button and a timeline that will animate through. And then we also have button groups. These are the three main types of filtering options available in Flourish templates, but we'll also be showing another example, which is a clickable legend. So why might you want to use filtering? There are many different reasons and different use cases for using filtering. You might have a lot of data that you don't always want to show all at once, or you might just want to use your filters to break down data into different categories. You can use them to let the users explore the data for themselves. The controls and filters in your Flourish visualizations are user-facing controls, so people can switch between the drop-downs or move through the time sliders and click on buttons themselves to explore their data. You might also want to use these time sliders to animate through time if you have that sort of data available. And also you can use filters to efficiently set different views in a story. We'll show an example of this in a bit, but this is where you can, instead of having to duplicate visualizations and drop in different types of data to create your narrative in a story, you can simply create one visualization with all the data in and then use a filter to easily and efficiently set those different views. So we'll start by showing a few examples of visualizations that our customers and also our team at Flourish have created using filters, just to show you the kinds of things that you can create. So to start with, we have a nice simple example, which was from the Bank of England. They've created these nice pie charts in Flourish. So this is where, when you have data that's not too complicated, but you want people to be able to explore it and break it down into those categories. So here what we have is the details about which households have reduced spending as a result of COVID. We've got pie charts that aggregate it using this all option in the filter, but we also have these different buttons that I can use to click and break down the data into different types of employment category. So I can select these different buttons, switch between them, and we get these nice smooth animations in the pie chart so that I can easily see how the data is changing across these different categories. So even when you have quite straightforward, simple data, the filters can really help enhance it and show you and let the user explore the differences between the different categories. We've got a slightly more complex example here that we've created at the Flourish team. This is our COVID data browser. So this here is using a couple of different types of filters, and we'll be coming back to this example later in the demo. But this is one of those ones where you have a lot of data in one single chart and you're wanting the user to be able to explore it themselves. So what we have here is what we call a multi-select series filter at the top here. This is where the user can remove these different countries and add in ones that they're particularly interested in. So I can select different countries myself and add them to the chart. This one chart in Flourish has got all those different countries' data available, but it's up to the user to decide what they want to filter to. So that's our series filter for the countries, but this chart has also got what we call a row filter. So in this one, we've also got different types of metrics in this single chart. So a user can actually choose to switch to total deaths data in this or total cases. So these different filters are being used to provide a lot of information in one go, but the user can choose what they're interested in. So we'll come back to this one later to show you the different filters that are possible and how you can get them into your chart. A third example here is a map example. So as I mentioned, the filters are going to be available across a lot of the different templates in Flourish. This one here is the example of a time slider. So here we have Google Trends data across the US, and this is showing the most searched issue by US county. And we've used a time slider here so that when I click play, this chart is going to animate and the data is changing over time. So we can see that at the start of our time slider in September last year, the Supreme Court was one of the most searched issues in a lot of the mid-US, but as it goes through, unemployment becomes a bigger issue. Just one more final example to show you about filters. This is the one about setting different views in a story. So what I have here is a straightforward line chart. This one's about bond yields. So I've got lines here for the different bond yields, and I have a filter here for different banks. So when I switch in this filter, it's going to show me the different banks' bond yields. But this is where you can use it to efficiently set views. If I had to create a chart for each of these 4 banks, that would be 4 charts that I'd need to keep updated, and 4 charts that I'd have to create separately, drop in the data separately, and then add to my story. Whereas if I use a filter here, I can create the one single chart that has all these 4 banks data in, and then duplicate my slides in my story to create the different views. So I've got one here for all the different banks except the last one. So I'm just going to hit duplicate on this slide. And on this final slide, I can select ECB, and that will be my final slide. So you can see here that I've used the filter to more efficiently create my story that's going to show through these different views of this single visualization. So that's just a few examples of the different ways that you can use filtering. We're now going to talk a bit about what templates you can use them in. So most of our templates support filtering in one way or another. The different templates obviously have all kinds of different forms, from maps to charts, and even some more content-based templates like cards. But all of these in some shape or form provide filtering options. The way you add filters and the data that you'll need to create those filters might vary slightly. So we're now going to go into how this filtering works across the majority of our templates. So the typical way that filters work is that it's a 2-step process when you're making your visualization. The first step is to find the filter column binding in the data tab and to bind your column from which you want to create the filter to that binding. Once you've got that set up, a control will automatically be added to your visualization, and you can go back to the preview tab where you've got the preview in the settings panel, and you can start customizing what your control looks like. So we're going to show an example of this way of adding a filter now. Let me just grab my examples. So this example here is a radar chart example. I've got some data here which is all about rating different dog breeds on different dimensions. But as you can see, I've got an awful lot of radars in my chart. I've got over 80 radars here, which doesn't really make it very suitable to show them all at once. So what I want to do is add a filter so that we're just going to show a subset of these radars at once and make it a bit more user-friendly. So the first thing to do is to go to the data tab. In this tab, you can see what my data looks like. I've got my radars that are being made up of these dimensions here that is bound to my values, but I've also got this filter binding. So once I add a single column to this filter binding, it's going to use the categories in that column, in this case, to create a filter from them. In this case, I've got this column B here, which is the American Kennel Club group. It's sort of the breed type here. So I'm going to use this as my filter binding. So bind that to column B. As soon as I've done that, once I go back to the preview tab, the visualization has automatically added this filter to the top of my chart here. And you can see that I can now use this to filter between those different groups. So that's the basics of getting the filter in there. But now I can start to customize what I want my filter to look like and how it should behave. And that usually happens in the settings panel. You'll find across our visualizations, they'll usually be called controls or controls and filters. Something along those lines is where you'll find how you can customize your controls. So under this setting, the first thing is the type of control. So those are those three controls I mentioned at the beginning. By default, I've got a drop down here, but I could use a button group instead, just by clicking on this one. That's going to create, instead of a drop down, I have this group of buttons that still behaves in the same way, but I can see all of them at once. So typically your drop down is going to be most useful when you have quite a lot of categories that you don't want to have separate buttons all for. The button group is good when you just have a handful of categories. We can probably just about get away with it here. And then your time slider is only going to be suitable when the column that you're using for your filter is that time series data. So it might be years, or if you've got a smaller time frame, it could be individual days or something like that. But in this case, the time slider is not going to be suitable. So I'm going to stick with the button group at this example. And underneath here is how we can customize your controls. So there's going to be a few different settings, and these will be similar across the templates that use filters in this way. So for a drop down, I will get different options for customizations to my button groups. So button groups, one thing I can do is add a title. So this is where you can use the titles in different ways. You might just want to indicate what am I filtering here. So I could use, say, breed type, and it's going to give just an indication of what this filter is all about. Some people also want to use this title occasionally to kind of instruct people that there is a filter available there. So you might want to use the title here to say, click to select breed type, just a kind of instruction to the user to show that there is a filter available. Once I've done that, I can choose some more styling options for my filter. For the buttons, I can choose for them to be grouped or not. If I turn this off, we're going to get individual buttons rather than them being sort of strung together. You can see the slight difference there. I also have some button width options. So this is where if I want to have the buttons filling the whole width of the visualization, or I can have a fixed width. The auto width is going to fit the values that will fit in the buttons themselves. So adjust the size to fit the text. So I'm going to stick with that. Sorting is something you might want to look at, particularly if you have a drop-down menu. So I'll just switch to drop-down here. If you have a drop-down menu, particularly if you have a lot of different categories, the sorting might be important to you. So using the unsorted option, it's going to order the values as they appear in the data sheet. So here I've got herding, then terrier, and you'll see that in my data sheet, that's what my data starts with. So it's just going to take the order as it is in the data sheet. Alternatively, I can choose this category sorting, and that's going to order them alphabetically. So it might be to make it easier for users to be able to find the category they're wanting, you can order them. And if you do have a filter that is a more time series, you can also order them as if they were date times instead. So I'm going to stick with my category sorting here, so it's alphabetically. One other thing to note with filters across our templates is that sometimes you'll want to have an all option available. So you may want to be able to filter between your categories, but also have a selection where you see all of them at once. In this case, it's a bit too much because remember that I've got far too many radars to be showing all at once. So this option might vary a little bit between the templates, but just hovering over this setting here, I can see that in order to remove that all option, I've just got to blank this field. So I'm going to remove this here, and that's going to take away that all option so that it's just going to leave the different categories on their own, and the user won't have that experience where they get them all at once. Underneath these kind of behavior settings of how your filter will work, you also get the styling settings. So this is where you can choose exactly what your control looks like. I'm going to switch back to the button type just so we can see this nice and clearly. For the button type, I now get a lot of different settings to really fully customize what my buttons will look like. Here I can change these three here. It's going to be the fill color of the buttons. So I've got a background color. If I go for slightly off-white, that's going to change the background color of my unselected buttons. I've also got one for selected. So let's go for a really bright blue here. That's going to be this one here that's currently selected. And I can also set one for mouse over. So this can be useful if you really want to kind of improve the user experience. And I can go for a slightly darker color here. And as I'm hovering over my buttons, that's what the mouse over color is doing. Similarly, I can set the text color for each of these options. So it might be that when they hover over them, I want the text to be white, and that's going to change the text for the mouse over one. So you can see you get a lot of customization here. You can even enable this setting here so that we get some more options for the borders of the buttons. So you really get a lot of control over what your filter will look like. And these options should be similar across all of our templates with filters that work this way. So that's kind of an overview into how you set a filter when you have one of these templates where it's this two-step process where you set the filter column binding and then go back into the preview tab and then look into the settings panel to customize what your controls look like and how they behave. There are a couple of examples where filters work slightly differently in templates, and that's generally just because of the data structure or for the different purposes of the filter. So when you just have that one filter column, it's not going to let you add multiple columns to filter by. But in some templates, like the pictogram and the hierarchy, you might want to have multiple columns of values or sizes and use them to create a filter where you can switch between the different columns. So in this case, the filter is going to work slightly differently in terms of how you bind it to the data. So we'll just take a look at a couple of examples of this, starting with the pictogram. So this is my pictogram template here, where I've got different icons that are representing different values. And if I look in my data tab, at the moment, I've just got my category column and my single value column, which is the 2019 energy consumption. But I also have this second column here, which is what consumption was in 1970. So in the pictogram template, instead of having a binding that says filter, I can actually add multiple columns to my values binding. So instead of just column C here, if I add column B as well, I can add multiple columns to this value binding. And going back to the preview tab, it's now taken those two columns and created a filter out of them. So I can now switch between my two columns that I've added there. So it's just a slightly different way of setting up the filter in terms of the bindings in the pictogram template. And then similarly, as we've just shown, under the settings here, you can customize what your control looks like. So these settings will look familiar. And just remember that you can use this advanced toggle here to reveal extra settings available, like the sorting. Very similarly in the hierarchy template, so this one's where we've got nested levels of data, where these different parts of my sunburst here are being sized by a particular value column. If I go to my data tab here, you can see I've just got the single column bound to size by for now. But like the pictogram, I can actually add multiple columns to this size by binding in order to create a filter out of them. So it might be that I want to add this audience score and the Rotten Tomatoes score as well. So I can simply just add these extra columns to my size by binding, and back in the preview tab, I've now got a filter that is created from that, and changing the filter will resize all those sections of my hierarchy so that I can use this filter as a sort of way to adjust the sizing instead. The hierarchy here also has a separate filter binding. So this is going to work by having multiple filters. So you'll have one that adjusts the sizing and a filter that's going to actually adjust which values go into the chart at once. So it might be that here I can add a separate column, perhaps genre for my size, for my filter binding. So just undo there. D, comma, F to G. And my filter can be column B. In this case, I'm going to be able to have one filter for my size by and another filter for my different categories. So this is kind of showing you how the filters can work slightly differently, and it'll just be a case of working out what you're wanting to do for that particular template and what filters are available. One last example, which is a slightly different again, is the table template. So the table template, we actually have a search box that in itself acts as a row filter. But this one's a little bit more different. So this here, I've got a Flourish table, and you can see I've got a search box up the top here. If I start typing in the search box, it's going to filter my table to anything in the table that's matching the value I'm typing. So with the table template, what you're going to want to do, instead of looking for filter settings, you're going to go to the search settings. And this is how you can change how this search, which acts as a row filter, is going to behave. So it's got a few extra settings that won't be in other templates, things like search mode. So this is what it's going to actually search. If I use anywhere, this is where if I were to start typing Kansas, because it's searching anywhere in this column, it's going to return Kansas, but also Arkansas, because it's also got Kansas in it. So I can use the search mode to adjust this. Either the start or the whole mode will work here, so that I just return Kansas, the exact match for it. There's also some other settings you can customize here, things like placeholder text in this search. You can also choose to hide the table before the search, so it'll only reveal the right rows once I start typing. And I can include things like which columns to search and whether to include suggestions in the dropdown. So that's when I start typing, where it's going to populate with things that are in the table that I can search for. So the filter in the table works quite differently to other templates, but it's worth knowing that this search in itself acts a bit like a row filter. Okay, so that's our examples of where things work slightly differently. The one thing that we're going to talk about now is the line bar pie template. So this is one of our core templates that provides all those different basic charts that you can use. And it's a bit unique because it has multiple different filter options. So in the line bar pie template, you can create a row filter, a series filter, and you can also use a clickable legend as a filter. This clickable legend is also available in a few other templates that I've listed here, but we're going to be showing it in this one. So let's go back to this COVID example and show you around the line bar pie filtering options. So this is our COVID data browser. And first of all, let's just have a look at what our data looks like. So you can see here, I've got lots of values columns, one for each country. I'm just going to make sure these are all bound correctly there. So I've got all my countries going across. It looks like I don't have data values, but this is just because there's a lot of data in this template and we didn't have COVID cases this early on back in 2020 here recorded. So further down my data sheet, there are a lot of more data points. So I've got my columns with our countries going across the template. And then I've got rows that have both the dates and also different metrics. So I've got multiple rows for each country for each day because I've got different metrics that I'm showing. So this is quite a lot of data that this template is handling, but I'm using filters so that it's not too heavy and it's not too overwhelming and it doesn't show everything at once. So back in our preview tab, let's have a look at the different filters that it has available. So the first one we showed before is this multi-select series filter. So this is the one that's filtering our countries. So I can choose different countries in here. I can either just find them in the drop-down list, or I can start typing and add a country that way. And this is all happening as a series filter. So I'm going to go back to our control settings now just to show you how this works. So the series or column filter is what's taking any of the series in your data. So that's any columns that you've bound to the values binding, and it's creating a filter out of them. So I don't need to set an individual column binding for that series filter. It's going to use my values and create my filter out of them. And these are the different behaviors of the series filter. So this one is the multi-select filter, where I have options for setting the maximum number of series to show. So I could increase this to say 5, and that's going to allow users to add up to 5 series, and then it will give them a warning that you can only have 5 at a time. So that's how you can restrict it so that it can't ever look too overwhelming. And I can also choose how to customize settings like these placeholder text. So if you are creating visualizations for different languages or something along those lines, you're able to fully customize this kind of placeholder text where it's here saying enter series to show and where it says press to select over here, that you have customization over these. And again, you've also got some styling settings. So what your controls are going to look like, the colors and the text colors there. So back to the behaviors of the series filter, that's our multi-select, but you might also just want a single select filter. So I'm going to choose this option at the top here, and this one behaves a little differently. So this is when you only ever want to show one series at a time. It's not so much for comparison, but just so I can show a single country and just focus on them. So this one is going to kind of create a drop down that I can then switch between. So that's our series filter. And again, you've got things like this include all. I won't use this for this one because it'll be far too much in one go. But if you don't have quite so many series as this, you can also include an all option so that you can both just show one series at a time and also have that view with all the lines on the chart at once. That's our series and column filter. But in the line bar pie template, we've also got a second filter, which is the row filter. So this one here is where we've got, similar to the other templates, we have an extra column binding, which is for row filter. So in this example, we're using this for our metrics. I mentioned before that we've got lots of different metrics in this chart. So users can switch between cases and deaths and rates like cases per million and deaths per million. And I'm using that as my row filter. So I've bound that to column A, and back in my preview tab, that's what this setting is creating. So I can switch between the different metrics in my chart and see these different things all in one single chart instead of having to make multiple charts. I've also got an extra control in this chart, which is available in line bar pie, which is to switch between a linear and a log axes. So this is an extra control in itself that I've got on my chart. Again, all these settings look quite similar to the ones I showed earlier for styling. Just wanted to show one extra setting that's available in line bar pie, and that's this control position. So because we've got lots of different controls in the line bar pie template, you might want to rearrange the order in which they display. So in this case, I think it makes more sense to have my drop down here for the country, but then have my metric and then have my linear and log button afterwards, in which case I can use this option here to switch to series, row, log. Those are the types of filters. So I've got my series filter for the country, then my row filter for the metric, and then a user can choose the scale if they want to. So that's the series and row filters in line bar pie. But there's one extra type of filter that you can use as an alternative to the series filter, and that's the legend itself. So I've just got one more example to show you here. This one is a much more straightforward area chart that I've got about cereal yields by region. So I have a row filter, like the one we've just shown, where it's switching between the different crops. But I also have my series filter here so that I can just select one particular series at a time. Now, an alternative to the series filter is our clickable legend. So this legend here is currently static. I can't click on it to do anything. But if I remove my series filter, just under the control settings, turn this filter off, and I'm going to go to the legend settings instead. This setting here, click legend to filter data, is where you can use your legend as a filter itself. So now when I come over here, you can see that the items in my legend are actually clickable. I can click on each of them to just filter to that series. And then I can click a second time to add all the series back in. So that's the behavior of the single select legend filter, where I just want to see one series at a time and then click again to have them all showing at once. But I could also have a multi-select filter. This one has a slightly different behavior. Now when I click, it's not going to just filter to that series, it's actually going to remove that series. So I can have multiple items at a time by clicking and re-adding them. So this is another option as a filter, as an alternative to the series filter. I can use this legend, and it's sometimes a bit easier, less clutter on your chart because we just have a legend that acts as a filter and this color code as well. So it can be a nice option. I'm aware that we're close on time, but I just wanted to show one more example, which is about animating through time. So this is when you want to use time sliders when you have that time series data. But in order to achieve something like this animated pie chart we have here, we do need to adjust a couple of animation settings. So let's have a look at this example. First of all, let's take a look at our data structure. So in this case, instead of having categories for my filter, I've got time series. So my columns here indicate different time periods, in this case, different months. And then I have my columns, my rows of the different browsers and the different platforms. So in this case, I'm using a row filter for my column A. That's what's creating my filter here to switch between desktop and mobile. But I'm using my series filter to create this time slider. Let's just go back to the controls and filter settings, and you can see I now have this time slider option. But when I hit play at the moment, we've got some odd behavior going on my chart. which it looks like a bit of a bug. But this is because the Flourish's default behavior is to animate charts whenever the data changes. So when you make something like a Flourish story, we do the animation so that when you switch slides, it's going to have nice smooth animations from one chart to the next if they're in the same template. In this case, I don't want my chart to reanimate the whole chart every time the time slider moves along, because it defeats the purpose of wanting to have these sections growing and shrinking. So the first thing I need to do is go to the animation settings down here. And I need to disable this setting that is on by default, this one that says only animate series with the same name. This is going to prevent the chart from trying to match up sections at one point in the time slider to the other and completely reanimate them. So instead of that, now when I hit play on my time slider, we get this much more useful animation behavior where the time slider is playing through and the sections of my donut chart here are growing and shrinking according to the data, so that we can see how the Chrome section here is growing over time. Just a couple of last settings for the time slider. So just like we customized our drop-down and button group control, we can change things to do with the animation of the time slider under the control settings. So I can choose to have a play button. I can choose to loop my animation. So when it hits the end, whether I want it to loop through and go through the time slider again. So when I finish here, it's going to start over. And I can also change the speed. So if I reduce this time between steps, my time slider is going to move through much more quickly. So you can adjust the speed of your animation this way. And you can see that now we've got a really nice effective chart where we can see how Chrome is growing over time and winning a kind of browser wars here. So that's our final example to show. That's quite a lot of information about filters all in one go. But if you're wanting to have some more resources to help you guide you through some of these steps, we've got a bunch of help docs in these slides and a blog post as well. We have our social media links here if you're wanting to keep up to date with our Flourish charts. And just to let you know that in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be having our next tea break webinar, which will be all about how to leverage pop-up panels across your Flourish visualizations. That will be on the 12th of October.